All right, here we go. Well, good evening or good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is for you. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me today. And this is Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology. Today, not so much focused on Herman Bavinck as we are on Francis Turretin. So, one of the things that we've been doing is we study Herman Bavinck on what is for us on Monday nights, and on Thursday nights, we read some other books. And we've been reading the Oxford Handbook to Reformed Theology. And in that particular book, we've been reading about some of the historical figures and historic documents from part two of the handbook. And today we are reading a chapter 17, which is on Francis Turretin's Institutes of Elenctic Theology. And I'm just to give you a little bit of background. Turretin is someone, I've heard of, but I haven't read. And where I first heard about Turretin and about sort of his focus was actually when a cousin of mine went to seminary, and he knew I had some interest in potentially going to seminary and had decided not to at that time. But we would occasionally talk, chat, usually online, and about a little bit about what he was doing and what he was studying. He went to Westminster Theological Seminary out in California, and he was really excited about Turretin. He took a class on Turretin, I believe. The class was reading the Institutes of Elenctic Theology, and it was interesting to hear from him about Turretin, and especially because Turretin had not been, we talked last week about how there's some real key figures in the Reformed world, and Calvin is up there, and Augustine, even though it's pre-Reformation, is certainly up there. And then there's sort of other people who sort of fill in the blanks as who is third. Could it be John Owen? Could it be Francis Turretin? Could it be Herman Bavinck? And in my world, it was Herman Bavinck, even before a lot of his stuff was available in English. And I think that's why probably I heard a little bit less about Turretin. But my cousin went to seminary really just before a lot of Bavinck stuff came to be available in English. And so I think Turretin for him was that third person. And so reading this chapter by J. Mark Beach about Turretin, there were some things in there that were still pretty new for me, because I've not read a lot of Turretin, didn't know a lot about him. But then there was some that I recognized, that I was like, oh yeah, Shane told me about this when he was studying Turretin in seminary. And oh, I recognize this from a conversation that I had with Shane. So it was an enjoyable read, because there is a little bit of that, even where I was going in with somewhat of a blank slate, then there was a lot that I was recognizing in what I was reading. So before we get into the specifics of the chapter, Brock, I'm interested just a little bit. Last time you gave us sort of that idea of who is the third person of sort of the Mount Rushmore of Reformed theology, and how some people might put Turretin there, some people might put others there. But I think you probably were far more familiar with Turretin prior to our discussion today. So I'm interested in just knowing a little bit about your background with Turretin. What do you know? What did you know about him even before we got into this chapter? And what are the kinds of things you feel like we should have known if we didn't know already?
Yeah, well, Turretin is in some ways a high point in Reformed theology. If you think about Reformed theology in its, for lack of a better word, classical, or perhaps maybe the better word is scholastic form, then in a sense, Turretin might be the high water mark of Reformed theology. And for many people, he is. I'm less convicted about that personally because of some issues in scholastic versus non-scholastic conflicts in Reformed theology. And for those who don't know, in our generation, in my lifetime, Chuck's lifetime, there has been, let's say this, since the death of Cornelius Van Til, there's been a soul search in Reformed theology between people who want to maintain, let's call it, for lack of a better word, Turretinism. Maybe scholasticism is the right idea. The people who want to maintain this high water mark that is so well exemplified by Turretin. And of course, not just Turretin himself, but if you think of the sort of high water mark of the pre-modern golden age of Reformed theology, that's what so many people in our lifetime are interested in preserving. And the general narrative goes that it's against the soft, squishy, feel-goodism of modern accommodation. And so the battle in our lifetime has been that many in the scholastic Reformed tradition are extremely critical of the kind of Reformed theology that became accommodationistic, for lack of a better word. Corrupted by modernity is a sort of phrase you'll hear a lot, or themes you'll hear a lot. Cornelius Van Til, John Murray, a lot of the 20th century stalwarts of Reformed theology sort of come into fire and under question as being perhaps too ingratiated into modernity, picked it up, and whether it was conscious or not, whether it was intentional or not, by embracing and framing issues in theological discussions according to categories that are largely modern, these Reformed scholastics believe great harm has come to Reformed theology. And so, in a sense, there's almost this Turretin and Aquinas versus the 20th century Reformed personalities. Now, I believe it's greatly overdone. I believe it's really unfair. It's in my own view, not a particularly good example of generous theology. It would almost be the opposite. It would almost be Reformed people being bad stewards of their Reformed theology to want to elevate Aquinas and Turretin and displace John Murray, Cornelius Van Til, John Frame, so many others in the late 20th century for being corrupted, for being modern, for being loose, for being not staunch. And because of that, I come to this with a slight antagonism towards Turretin. That's perhaps a bit unfortunate because I should not let my opinion of Turretin be influenced by, let's say, Turretin-style disciples in the 21st century now in which we live. And many of them are aggressive. Almost all of them are overstated in their accusations, in my opinion. And they're basically they're the kind of people who don't want you in their club. And they insist that Reformed theology has to sound like Reformed theology. It has to sound like it did in the halls of Geneva during Calvin's lifetime. In the halls, the continental halls during the lifetime of Turretin. Inheritors of the great tradition of Thomas Aquinas. And if it doesn't, well, you've failed. And because of all of that negativity, I've been for many years been prepared to have a lower opinion of Turretin. Having said that, having moved past this late 20th century, early 21st century garbage, this heuristic business, I'm quite delighted by Turretin. There is so much good to say about him that I can see why our Reformed friends, who are constantly making war with their other Reformed friends for not sounding Reformed enough, but I can see why they would love to see Turretin's scholarship advanced. It's great scholarship. Here's the issue. You can almost place Turretin contra Bavinck, in the sense that Bavinck is the ultimate insider in modern territory. Chuck, you and I have talked about this. Bavinck grew up was educated in conservative circles, but during his university time, he wanted to try his faith in the hands of the new liberal university system in the 19th century. You and I have talked about the Jena School, the Wissenschaften, the emerging Wissenschaften, the study of the humanities that we now sort of take for granted as exemplifying what it means to have a university education in the West. And so Bavinck really leaned into that, and profitably so. And why do I say profitably so? Well, because, Chuck, I'm talking with people in academic university systems much more than I'm talking with people who came out of medieval schools or came out of medieval monasteries, or who were influenced by the scholasticism of Aristotle or Aquinas, or the methods, the scholastic methods and language. And where the great fault line here, so the more I work with Turretin, the more I'm pleased with him in his theology. I'm absolutely less than pleased with this 21st century development, which I consider to be really a dark spot for our tribe in our lifetimes. And so it's been a learning process for me too. If John Owen is difficult reading for modern readers, we're going to see how Turretin also fits that mold in a different sense. So Owen has a certain wordiness and prolixic style, which we've talked about on the episode that we did with him. Turretin writes in a manner that you can see sort of has this it's an intellectual descendant of the Summa Theologiae style of Thomas Aquinas. Beautiful style. And it follows a certain method, and it has a certain charm to it. Where everything goes wrong is when the 21st century scholastics insist that people like a Van Til, people like a Murray, people like a John Frame, people potentially like a Herman Bavinck have lost some major essence of Reformed theology by speaking intelligibly to moderns, instead of making the moderns learn our language. And that's almost entirely what this issue is about. Chuck, in our nation, in the United States of America, there have been people who respond to the inflow of people from other countries and say, well, they're here now, let them learn English. And it's almost like these Reformed folks are like that with Reformed theology. Oh, they want to interact with us? They want to talk about Reformed theology? Well, let them learn Turretin. Let them learn Aquinas. And I think Bavinck, during his lifetime, chose the better path. He speaks using their categories, modern's categories. Cornelius Van Til, for example, is accused of being, of all things, a Kantian. Ignorant people. I mean, Van Til wrote a book against Kantianism. And yet, these 21st century muckety-mucks see fit to, well, Cornelius Van Til, as he's fallen into the compromising acids of modernity. Oh, my goodness. Reformed people in those camps, I want to be generous, and we will be generous, but, that is so on the last nerve. And it's ugly. There's an ugliness to it that will not thrive, that will not survive. And sorry, Chuck, we got really pushed onto this, but I felt like I had to bring that background in because I was prepared to dislike Turretin. So when it comes to people in our tribe, hardly dislike any of them. Over the last 400 plus years, hardly a person for me to dislike. One of the few who I just can't stand is Augustus Toplady. If you read Toplady, he is partisan ugly in all the worst fashions. Now, he wrote Rock of Ages. Praise God. I'm not throwing him out of our tribe. I'm not saying he's not, I'm not saying he's not doctrinally sound, but he is a great example of partisanness at its worst. And so many folks who value Turretin so highly and want Turretin to be the lingua franca of Reformed theology have his aggressive partisan spirit. And that's a big loss for us. So when I come to Turretin in the last couple of years, even though I'm put off by the negativity of this fight, I have to say, there is an exceptional quality to Turretin's theology that I think makes voluntary reading of Turretin a great idea. This isn't saying don't read Turretin. This is about saying don't make it mandatory. Don't make Reformed theology rise and fall with understanding that scholastic style, that scholastic way of speaking, the categories that are being used to talk about things. Bavinck went out into the marketplace of ideas. He spoke using the language and categories of the people of his day. Why? Not because he held their positions, but because in doing that, he could reach the audience God put in front of him. And I think for us Reformed people to be entrenched and insist that modern people must first engage and speak our language, I don't think that's going to play well. So Chuck, that was a long way to sort of, in a roundabout manner, come back to where Turretin is here. And because of that, I've had to unlearn, and I've had to start just enjoying him and appreciating him for the first-rate theologian that he actually is, even though, and I'm going to say it one more time, he has a bunch of second-rate disciples in the 21st century. And let me say no more about that as we move through here. But Chuck, when it comes through on your end, when you've talked, like you say, you've talked with some people who had the greatest of respect for Turretin, who sort of put him in that guiding star position for reasons that you and I are going to agree on. I mean, this is a fabulous choice. What were some of the things that they keep going back to that makes Turretin's theology so insightful, B, so deep, and C, so worthy of being perhaps the way that we even organize our thoughts about theology?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think your description of sort of the controversy around sort of the 21st century followers of scholasticism is helpful. In some ways, it makes me understand even better than some of the research I did, after reading this chapter, a little bit about even my own background in this, because I think it is pretty clear that my own background, the college that I went to, the folks in my denomination who are probably most looked up to, they're not in that scholastic camp. Scholasticism is a little bit of a boogeyman among a lot of Christian Reformed scholars, and part of that is potentially because even though Van Til left the CRC and became Orthodox Presbyterian, Van Til is very highly respected, and many CRC people still think of Van Til as our guy, even though he became an OPC, a member of the OPC and a pastor in the OPC after he left the CRC. And then, of course, Bavinck and some others as well, who are engaging more with modernity. And I think that's sort of the milieu that I come out of. My cousin's appreciation for Turretin, and I think why when he went to Westminster in California, what I call Westminster West, I think one of the reasons they were focused on that is because of some concern, I think, among more conservative Dutch Reformed folks that sort of my tribe had gone a little too far in the progressive direction, and that there was sort of an attempt to bring that back, and bringing in some level of Reformed scholasticism was a way of doing that by anchoring in sort of the older part of the Reformation and not getting lost sort of in the modern. Now, I don't think people like Bavinck and Van Til have gotten lost in the modern. Just, I agree with you on that. But I think that was one of the reasons, likely, why my cousin, when he went to Westminster West, was encouraged to take an entire semester class just on Turretin. So, and I think that makes sense. That Westminster West was training a lot of folks who were part of the schism out of the CRC that formed the United Reformed Church. And so some of their concerns to pull things back, that makes some sense. The other thing, though, what I would say, the other part of your question is, well, what are those things that I've seen in Turretin and in my discussions with people who like Turretin that sort of attracts me, even though I might, if I had to, be partisan and pick a side, okay, I'm going to pick Bavinck. I'm going to go on the Van Til side. But what draws me to Turretin, I think, and the thing that I picked up in this chapter, but also had picked up in my discussions in the past with my cousin, are especially relate to how Turretin deals with covenant theology and the categories that he creates in covenant theology. Now, I will say that there are some pieces of that maybe uncomfortable is too strong a word to say. I'm uncomfortable with some of the ways that Turretin talks about the various covenants. There is a sense in which I think maybe it's that scholastic style that rubs me a little bit, I was like, I'm not sure that's the best way to describe it. But there is also much there in the ability to really sort of walk through, using the scholastic method to walk through the idea of the covenant and where does this come from and what is the nature of the covenants and what is the covenant of grace and how does that relate to the covenant within the Trinity and those kinds of things. And during the time that I was doing some studying on these issues, it was helpful. I wasn't directly reading Turretin, but I was reading people who were very much affected by Turretin in thinking about some of those issues around the covenant. And so that's one specific area where I thought that there was some help. One of the things that I did actually is after I had read this chapter, and it's clear, Mark Beach is very clear that Turretin is a scholastic, right? He is a reformed scholastic, and I will say that to some extent that term scholastic has been a little bit of a dirty word in some of the sort of the milieu that I've been in. Some of that goes back actually not to the Reformed scholastics, but even if you think about Martin Luther wrote against the scholastics. John Calvin referred to scholastics, meaning the Roman Catholic scholastics, and often very much lambasted them as well. And so some of it is that older form where Calvin and Luther and some of those very early Reformation figures were really arguing against Roman Catholic scholasticism. There is also a sense, though, that even maybe that Reformed scholasticism, there are those who are critical that Reformed scholasticism maybe takes in too much of, Greek ways of thinking over and against Hebrew ways of thinking. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, and in some ways it's not necessarily fair. But that's also something that I had heard, and some people that I studied under sort of followed that. Even if you read like some of Francis Schaeffer, I know not everybody's a fan of Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer, and some of the ways he talks about sort of certain philosophical categories, I think it's fair to say he kind of comes down pretty hard on even Reformed scholasticism, and so some of that, is sort of in my background as well. But in doing a little bit of looking, I actually found a really interesting article in Credo magazine, which is a magazine that's out there, and it's available on the web, and I will actually send a link to that in our in-call chat here, and maybe we will get an opportunity to add that to the comments. But it's an article from Credo magazine and from 2023 entitled "What is Reformed Scholasticism?" and the author Ryan McGraw makes the point that there is a sense in which we often think of the scholastics as the bad guys, but Reformed scholastics, that's something different. It really is about a method. It is about a way of thinking through issues, and it can be very helpful in very specific areas. The author McGraw makes the point that scholasticism in some ways is a very nebulous word. When you use it in certain ways, you might mean one thing. When you use it in other ways, you might mean another thing. And so we have to be careful about, just as, some of the followers of Turretin tend to sort of want to label, people like Bavinck as crass modernists. I think we also have to be careful not to use scholastic in a way that only refers to sort of the worst of sort of the medieval Catholic scholastics, recognizing also that there was much good that even came from that. And that Reformed scholasticism, it's hard to define, but it is really about this kind of method, a way of thinking through things, an ability to define terms and make distinctions and use certain scientific terms and draw categories drawn from Neoplatonism or from Aristotle, and then to revise and simplify some of Aristotle's logic as a teaching tool. Scholasticism in many ways is a tool. And Beach makes that point here too in our chapter, that Reformed scholasticism is a particular tool that can be very useful. And in this article from Credo magazine, McGraw also, he points out that, the scholastic method can bring some really important benefits. It sharpens our thinking, he says. But he says we also have to be careful because of the way it can ruin our speaking, that Reformed scholasticism can potentially teach people to think more clearly, but if it's misused, it can also lead them to communicate more poorly. And so let's use the tool in a way that helps us communicate more clearly and not more poorly. McGraw says, in thinking about how Reformed scholasticism leads us to think more clearly, he points to Trinitarian theology and Christology as areas where we most need a level of distinction and precision to understand many of the concepts. And he says, a lot of people think that post-Reformation Trinitarian theology and Christology really draw from, the Nicene and the Chalcedonian era, and yet that's not enough. It's not enough to say that, Reformed Trinitarian theology is Nicene and Chalcedonian, because most Reformed theologians have explained the Trinity, they have explained Christology based on the categories that were created in the medieval era by the scholastics, and then that were followed through by Reformed scholastics. And so the study of Christology and the study of the Trinity, and that even gets into some of those issues around the covenant that I identified. The tool of Reformed scholasticism can be a helpful tool in helping us to sort of put down some definitions and to be clear about what it is that we're talking to. Another point that he makes, and I think this is another reason why even those of us who come from a background that maybe is more Bavinkian and Ventilian, one of the reasons I think we ought to study some of the Reformed scholastics, and especially people like Turretin, who are sort of the sort of the high point of that way of teaching and that way of thinking about certain issues, is because just because people abuse it doesn't remove our ability to use it. There's a Latin proverb, abusus non tulit usus, or abuse does not remove use. You don't stop eating because you're afraid of food poisoning. You don't avoid heart surgery because a surgeon can make a mistake. And in the same way, Reformed scholasticism, it can be used in improper ways. It can be used by people who maybe, we would disagree with the way that they sort of insist on it's my way or the highway as you think about these issues. But that misuse doesn't mean we shouldn't use what's good out of Reformed scholasticism, and we ought to be reading them even today. McGraw talks about Turretin, of course. He talks about some others as well. Jerome Zanchius, Peter van Maastricht, Johannes Heidegger, Johannes Maccovius, Hermann Wittius, Wilhelmus of Brakel. A number of those names actually came up in this chapter as well, as people who sort of took that Reformed scholastic way thinking, they used it as a tool to help them to understand. Now, this chapter specifically, it's about Turretin specifically, but it really is about his Institutes of Elenctic Theology. And Brock, I don't know how much you've had the opportunity ever to read either pieces or, even maybe large chunks of the Institutes of Elenctic Theology. I understand it can be a pretty difficult read. You have to have some sense of Reformed scholasticism and the tools that are used and sort of the categories that are used there. But it does seem like that this has really become the classic of Reformed scholasticism, and perhaps one of the best pieces of writing to use that tool in a way that it should be used, right? Rather than abusing it. And it's interesting. I had no idea, even I'd heard of the Institutes of Elenctic Theology, and for whatever reason, I'd never looked up Elenctic to see what it meant until actually I read this chapter. And it is interesting because the idea behind Elenctic is that it's a disputation, right? It's basically saying, okay, this is what people think about these issues, and now I'm going to dispute that and say, here's what I think actually is true. And that's what he does here. And that method can also be very helpful because it, especially if those issues remain, it is a way of learning the issues based on what's going on around those issues. Where there can be, if we start to think that method is as broad as a systematic theology, we could be in trouble, right? Because an Elenctic theology is going to deal with the disputes and isn't going to deal so much with the things where there aren't disputes, where everybody sort of agrees. Whereas a systematic theology is going to say, no, we got to get all of these things down, right? And so if you're reading Turretin as solely as a systematic theology, you're going to miss some stuff. And that maybe is why there's been some criticism of it as well. But if you understand what he's trying to do, what Elenctic theology is, it actually does kind of make some sense. And I guess I'm interested, in your connection, if any, with this particular institutes of Elenctic theology, Brock, and the connections you've had with it and any information you have about it.
Yeah. So let me read from a passage that came up in my research a few years ago. It's from Turretin's Institutes of Elenctic Theology. It perhaps summarizes some of what is best about Turretin and also exposes some of the particularities of his style. Now, Chuck, we've already talked about everybody has a style, when they write down, we talked about Owen's style. And if you're going to go far in John Owen, you're not only going to have to learn to read and work with Owen's writing style, but you're going to have to love it, because if you don't love it, you're not going to get through it. And Turretin, in his style, falls into the same situation. So let me get into my particular situation. I was looking for some information on the divine concursus. You and I are doing a section in Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 2, Chapter 7, on the Divine Council. And one of the questions that comes out reading that chapter is, how does the divine will and the human will interact? And more generally, how does God's will concur with the creature's will and with the activities in the creation as well? We'll hear people talk about secondary causes. How do things happen? How do things fall out in the world God has made? And Turretin has some great ideas and answers here. So let me read. This is from his work there, and it's the sixth question in, let me go up here. It's the sixth question. Does God concur with secondary causes? So this is on the nature of the physical and moral concourse. Now let me go down to the sixth question. The sixth question in this series is this: how can the concourse of God be reconciled with the contingency and liberty of secondary causes, especially the will of man? Chuck, that's beautiful. This is Turretin treating on the topic that you and I are reading about in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 2, Chapter 7. And so several years ago, I found this from Turretin, and he has some beautiful things to say, but you're not going to appreciate them without significant investment. And so here's the answer. And I'm just reading. So the sixth question is, how can the concourse be reconciled? How can God be sovereign, and how can people have a moral agency? And in this sixth question, I believe there are, I'm going to have to go down and check, maybe 19 different paragraphs of answers. So there are 19 different sections representing Turretin's response on this topic. And let me just start reading from the sixth paragraph. So I'm just going to read, and I'm going to try to read it in the best and generous way possible. But this is Turretin answering in the sixth way. He says this, he says, God so concurs with secondary causes that although he previously moves and predetermines them by a motion, not general only, but also special, still he moves them according to their own nature and does not take away from them their own proper mode of operating. The reason is because as the decree of God is occupied not only about the determination of things which ought to be done, but also of the means according to which they are to be done relative to the nature and condition of each, thus actual providence, which is the execution of this decree, secures not only infallible futurition of the thing decreed, but also its taking place in the very manner decreed, to wit, agreeably to the nature of each, i.e. necessarily things take place necessarily, free and contingent things, however freely and contingently. For as there are two kinds of causes, some definite and general, always acting in the same way, as, for example, fire which burns, the sun which shines. Others, indefinite and free, which can act or not act in this way or that way. So God conserves their nature and concurs in acting with them according to it. With the definite, he himself determines them without a proper determination. With the indefinite and free, however, they also determine themselves by the proper judgment of reason and the free disposition of the will, which God does not take away from man because he would thus destroy his own work, but leaves and strengthens it. And that further, that admirable force of providence here displays itself, by which it so joins itself to the nature of each thing, that although infallibly and necessarily carrying out the thing decreed, still this is accomplished conveniently to its nature, by the intervention of the second cause, by reaching from end to end strictly, and disposing all things sweetly. Chuck, I love that little ending there, disposing of all things sweetly. If you are a causologist, that is to say, if you are a scientist studying the nature of causality, I think there's a lot to love about that sixth paragraph, that sixth answer to that question. But Chuck, that's a daunting read. That's a daunting read for the people you and I love and care about. That's a daunting read for our congregations. That's a daunting read for our apologetic interactions. So, what are we to do with this? By the way, I read that sixth paragraph. This is Institutes of Theology. How many scriptural citations did I cite in that reading? If you would say 0, you would be correct. And there is some concern here. Oftentimes, one of the accusations against Reformed theology theologians who are scholastic, is that they love philosophy more than the scriptures. Now, friends, I'm not saying that about Turretin here. Chuck and I have talked at length in other contexts about how sometimes theologians can give long responses without citing this verse or that verse, and it's not always a negative. Having said that, this sixth question has, and while I have the tab open, I'm just going to count them here. I read from answer 6, and it goes down to 11. Is that right? Yes. Yeah, 11 paragraphs answering the sixth question on the divine concurrence. And I remember finding 2 scripture references. And there are going to be critics who say and make a point, where did the scriptures go in our theology? And I think that's something we have to consider here with Turretin. Turretin comes up with a beautiful answer. By the way, one to which I completely agree. That section I read, I agree with what he said. It's beautiful what he said. But tie that back in to the Holy Scriptures. I don't know that we're there. And so pretty soon, you can see some of our critics, some critics of Reformed theology, will say things like Calvinism claims to be about the scriptures, but what they really love is philosophy, and what they really love is classical theism, and what they really love is Greek, pagan, speculative theology. And listen, I'm not putting Turretin in that class. I don't think he is. I think he's much better than the accusation. But that paragraph I just read to you, if I read that in a Sunday school, if I read that in a sermon, do you think our congregation is going to sit there and think, wow? You know, I think there's a lot of reasons why an average layperson would listen to this and say, yeah, I think I agree with the critic of Calvinism who says that maybe Calvinism has lost itself in some pagan Gnosticism because of paragraphs like this. So there we are, Chuck. Some of the best of Turretin is that he organizes and presents these amazing, intense, deep, wise, insightful answers to some of the most pressing theological questions. But at what cost? Potentially, we're off the range. Potentially, we're off into our own scholastic world. Potentially, we're off into a scholastic Aristotelianism. That means we always have to talk about God in these certain ways that our critics say really just a form of pagan Greek philosophy. So that's a complicated issue. I think Turretin is better than that, but I can certainly see why other people might disagree. And finally, to answer your question, what about Elenctic theology? Elenctic theology is ultimately a negative. Elenctic theology is exposing the error of the person you are reading. In a sense, it is a form of criticism, as the moderns would call it, where we critique the work of another theologian by exposing error. Nothing wrong with exposing error, but that which motivates you also influences your final output. What do people who make Elenctic theology their major purpose and theme end up becoming? They end up becoming critics. And in a sense, they end up becoming the moderns, some form of the moderns that they themselves say they oppose. So when your focus is Elenctic theology, and not on the other aspects of it. Which, by the way, the best scholastics will say it's not all about being elenctic. It's not all about polemics. But ultimately, when you're in that mode, you're constantly taking a big tribe and making it smaller because brother so-and-so doesn't quite agree with how you see it. Now, in Turretin's lifetime, who was the big example of this? It was Amiraldism. Moses Amirat in the Samar school in France had his, what we sometimes today call his 4-point Calvinism. And Turretin vigorously opposed him. Well done. I think the opposition needed to happen. But that's what you see with the Turretini in the 21st century. You see that they are disciples with a critical eye, looking for heresy and finding heresy in almost all forms of doctrinal disagreement. And that's a little bit too black and white for where you and I have decided things need to be. Now, Chuck, those are just our personal opinions. The other people are welcome to their more black and white opinion, even as we maybe have something, the whole point of this show is generous theology. But at the same point in time, if they can have the courage of their convictions, we can have the courage of ours, and we can also have a slightly larger tent. And this is what I've found with most 21st century Turretini. Not all, by the way, most, is that they spend their entire lives dwindling their tribe. And one wonders at the end of the day, where was the increase? So that's, I think, a big part of the assessment there. Now, Chuck, I actually enjoyed reading that paragraph to people. I'm a professional not in the sense that I get paid, but I really live for writings like that. And I had to spend just hours working through what Turretin was saying. Our people in the congregations, our lay people, our Sunday school people, they're not going to hit this for the first 20 years, if they ever hit this. And I think that should be kept in mind. And so then to then make Turretin's precision the Reformed standard is, well, it's one way to make a big tribe smaller, as I've mentioned here. Let me throw it over to you. When you think about the role of Elenctic theology, you've talked about the positives. We've talked about some of the positives of scholasticism. Supposedly it's about method and not content. By the way, slight pushback here. I say supposedly, Chuck, because all of the scholastics I've talked with not only want me to affirm a certain method, which I think I affirm. I would call myself scholastic if it was truly a method, but not one of them actually seems to mean it. And I'll tell you how I know. God as actus purus is content, not method. And you are out if you do not affirm God as actus purus. It's a litmus test of orthodoxy in these 21st century scholastic wars. And I cannot reconcile people who say scholasticism is only about method, but then insist that if your method doesn't lead to the right content, you're out. So that's where I am, Chuck. I don't know where we'll go from here with those folks. I have found some very positive Reformed scholastics who I not only respect but admire and appreciate, and they've completely changed my opinion of the scholastic method and Reformed theology over where it was in these other interactions. So I don't want this to be a downer. I also don't want generous theology to be a misnomer where I'm clubbing our brothers and sisters under the guise of being generous to them. I know this has been a way to say it, but there really is so much, none of this affects the fact that Turretin is the giant that we've been trying to say he is this entire session. So let me throw it back over to you, Chuck, to sort of, see what you can recover from kind of the aggressive analysis.
Yeah, no, and that's very interesting. As you spoke about some of the negatives of Elenctic theology or the Turretini, I like that term. It reminded me a little bit of a popular Christian rock song by the band Petra called Witch Hunt. And one of the lines in that song is, looking for evil wherever they can find it, on a crusade, hope that God won't mind it. Now, I don't think that Petra was actually writing that song about Reformed scholastics or the Turretini. I don't think that's the case. But there is that danger, I think, to Elenctic theology, to always arguing in that particular way, always arguing against, where you can sort of start to go on these witch hunts, looking for evil wherever you can find it, on a crusade, hope God won't mind it. And it's good to be reminded of that, because there are times when we should be criticizing those with whom we disagree, but we shouldn't let that become sort of the only way that we deal with these issues. And it is a good reminder of that. And as you've pointed out, there are many followers of Turretin, many followers of scholastic Reformed theology who aren't necessarily on that witch hunt. And that is important to remember as well. And it's important for us to stay away from doing that as well. And as far as, it is interesting. There is a sense, I agree with you. There is a sense in which the average Kleine Leuten in the pews, little person, may never get to the level where they want to read the Institutes of Elenctic Theology, read much of Turretin. There is a sense also, though, that I think it is important for some people who are, sort of leading their congregations, pastors and theologians, to have some understanding, because I think using the tool of Reformed scholasticism, you can get at some important issues. And covenant theology, federal theology is one of those, right? There has been a good deal of argumentation in the Reformed world about sort of the exact nature of the various covenants. Is the covenant of works, was that sort of present and the primary covenant before the covenant of grace? Or is the covenant of works really not so much covenant, but sort of just a way of looking at the covenant of grace at a particular time? Those issues can become important. Not, it's not that we have to have tests on, okay, you'd like to become a member of our congregation, we're going to give you a test. And what is the covenant of grace? What is the covenant of works? How do they work together? And how do they relate to the covenant of redemption? Provide a 3-page blue book answer and give citations. No, that's not how we gain members of a church. But in our preaching, I think having some knowledge of these issues and then applying them to the everyday issues of life. What does it mean to live a holy life? What does it mean to respond in obedience? Those are things that I think, sort of relate to some of those issues. And Turretin, I think, on a lot of those issues of the covenant, is an important person to read. Whether you agree with every single conclusion he makes or not, I think you have to really understand a lot of what's happened in more recent years on issues like the federal vision, on issues like the argument between people like Norman Shepherd at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, to understand a little bit of what Meredith Kline is talking about. Some of these, modern theologians, it helps to have sort of this background in Turretin, and to have read it. In the section of our chapter here by Mark Beach, he has a section entitled Select Observations Concerning Turretin's Institutes. And he makes a number of points. There's select observations, as he says, but he makes some points that I think are helpful to understanding why it is that at least those who are going to go more deep into Reformed theology ought to have some awareness of Turretin and what he has to say. And so here are some of the comments and some of the observations that he makes regarding Turretin's institutes. First, he says, Turretin's opponents figure prominently in the shape and texture of his work. These opponents are principally Roman Catholics, Socinians, and Remonstrants or Arminians, but also include, various Lutherans and Anabaptists and the as well the Emeraldians. He's probably more focused, more vitriolic when it comes to sort of Catholic theology and Arminian theology, but recognizing that this is an issue, the issue of Emeraldism, he does deal with that. And so these opponents figure prominently in his writing. And what he was really trying to do, as Beach puts it, is to defend the hard-won gains of the earlier codification of Reformed theology that was achieved by Calvin and his contemporaries, particularly against what Turretin perceived as the Pelagianizing acids that dissolved the primacy of divine grace and transgressed the right teaching of Catholic Augustinianism. So just as we talked about with Owen, just as we've been talking about in some ways with Bavinck, what Turretin is really fighting against in many ways is that Pelagianizing acid that seems to just come up generation after generation, that wants to believe that humans are able on their own to affect their salvation in some way. And that we're not necessarily completely dead in our sins, but can sort of figure things out ourselves. And what Turretin really wanted to say is, no, that's not it at all. We have to understand the depth of our sin in order to really understand salvation. And he really wants to fight against that Pelagianizing influence. So related to that, then, Turretin upholds the doctrine of grace alone and persistently argues against Pelagian and semi-Pelagian doctrines, even as he promotes the findings of the Synod of Dort against the Remonstrants. And again, that sort of fits, one of the interesting things you mentioned a little bit, that Elenctic theology is kind of a negative theology. It's really about saying this is what we're against. I had someone I knew who used to always talk about the beginners. Those are the people who are just against everything. They can never say what they actually think. They can only say what they're against. Well, Elenctic theology is kind of a beginner's theology. Now, it doesn't mean that, they can't understand positive, didactic type issues. And there's some of that in Turretin as well. But it's interesting to me that Beach really points out that Turretin is really trying to defend Dort, the canons of Dort and the decisions of the Synod of Dort, now, decades in the past. And it's interesting to me, especially because even in my own world, where the three forms of unity are the primary confessions that we use, the Belgic and the Heidelberg, they tend to be more didactic. They tend to be more positive in sort of the way they present what they believe. And Dort is, in some ways, an Elenctic document. It's saying, this is what we're refuting. This is what we're arguing against. And this is why they're wrong. And even today in the 21st century, I sometimes hear people say, well, yeah, I know it's one of our confessions, but it's so negative. Well, there's a purpose to that. There's a purpose, I think, to this Elenctic theology, but we shouldn't let it be the be all and end all. One of the things I love about being a three forms of unity church is that we have that, the canons of Dort, but we also have Heidelberg and the Belgic to sort of provide the balance to that. And there's a sense in which I think too that we need to balance Turretin with others that we read who may become, more positive, more, not so much just attacking what we don't agree with, but saying what we do agree with. But there is also a sense that we need some of that. We need to still be on our guard against some of those issues. And Pelagianism keeps rearing its ugly head, right? And so, it's been dealt with in many different centuries by many different writers, whether they were Catholic in the past, whether they were Reformed in the Reformation folks, whether it's the scholastics, whether it's more modern Reformed thinkers in recent years, that Pelagianism is something that keeps rearing its ugly head, and we do need to argue against. And the Amaraldians were Turretin's foremost concern, because he felt that even though it's a 4-point Calvinism, maybe it's 80% Calvinism, there is still that worry that it leads. Where does it go? Bobbing talks about this, right? That there's always this move away from real orthodoxy and towards a sort of a Pelagianizing way of thinking, and we need to avoid that. And Turretin was very much concerned that Amaraldianism was just a way that would lead us down a slippery slope towards Pelagianism. Turretin also was a federal theologian, or a covenant theologian. He developed his theology in the way of the twofold covenant: the covenant of nature, the covenant of grace. That latter covenant of grace being grounded in the intratrinitarian covenant of redemption, also called the Pactum Salutis. And that whole idea around covenant theology is really a key concept in Reformed theology. We sometimes miss it. People who think of Reformed theology as just being tulip, a lot of times miss the importance of covenant theology, and we don't want to do that. Covenant theology is really an important piece of what it means to be Reformed. And there are some different ways of conceiving that. I understand that. That's one area where, for example, Reformed Baptists have some difference with people more from the Presbyterian and the Dutch Reformed way of thinking. Although Reformed Baptists still are very much focused on covenant theology in a way that's maybe been lost outside of the Reformed world. But the covenant is really an important piece of what we get from Turretin, and it's I think something as a framework for biblical interpretation. It's really key to understanding who we are as the Reformed. Beach also makes the point that although Turretin asserts that his institutes cannot claim to be a full system of theology, there is in the work some marks of comprehensiveness despite that claim. He does take up some topics that aren't just disputations. He does go a little bit broader, and that maybe makes him, that makes him a little bit different than some of the other works of the Reformed scholastics, in that he does tend to go beyond that a little bit. Turretin's polemics, Beach says, frequently contain a good deal of positive theological argumentation. And so that's another important piece. And then finally, Beach says, within the broad context of the scholastic theology that emerged both on the continent and in the British Isles, although Turretin's institutes was certainly not marked by innovation, it wasn't something brand new. And this is going to sound very familiar because we talked about this with John Owen as well. It's not that he came up with all sorts of brand new ideas, but it also can't be dismissed as remote or simply repetitive. He labored deliberately in the role of codifier of Reformed orthodoxy. He wrote as a defender of the Reformed consensus, and in doing so, he aimed to bring Reformed thinkers into agreement with one another wherever possible. So what he's trying to do is to gather the Reformed consensus and say, hey, look, where we're having some disputes, let's let's talk about what is orthodox. Let's codify those things that we can agree on. And to some extent, that's what Turretin did as well. And that was a positive thing and an important piece of who he is and what he did as well. So I know we've come to the close of our time just about, Brock, but I just wonder, are there some closing statements, some final things that you'd like to say, whether about some of the things that I've mentioned here, some of these comments that Beach makes about the Institutes of Elenctic Theology, or some of the other topics that we've touched on with relation to Francis Turretin?
Yeah. Chuck, everything that was on the negative side tonight in this discussion session with Turretin is minor. It's absolutely minor. There's annoyances, there's some elbow banging in our tribe as we try and walk through this life together. And Turretin is one of the theologians that you train yourself for. You know, when you start in theology, you say, "Oh, I want to read good theology." No, I want to read the best theology. Well, what happened in my case, and what I think happens in almost everybody's case, is you have to spend 5 years, 10 years, 15 years learning how to read theology so that you can then read the best theology. John Owen, for all that we had to say about his difficult style, is top shelf. Augustine, Aquinas, Lombard, Anselm, you know, these are among the greatest that you can want to spend time on. And it's worth spending 10, 15, 20 years to learn how to read them. Well, in our tribe, Bavinck, it was a 10-year process for me from the time I first picked up Reformed dogmatics to me being able to sort of have a skeleton framework to hang all of the things Bavinck was going to talk about on. And it's the same with Turretin. But for those who do it, for those who make the pilgrimage, for those who willingly take the journey, Turretin is about as good as it gets. You know, literally, I would put up there Calvin, Bavinck, Turretin, you know, maybe Hodge, Warfield, Van Til, you know, maybe a couple of others, but, you know, in that top 2 or 3 of everything anybody has to say about Reformed theology, Turretin is right there with the deepest of insights. You can see why people, the Turretini, you could see why people would want him to be so representative of their tribe, because his theology is just at that level. All the disagreements, all the difficulties are just a matter of making it work. And Chuck, that's part of what we talk about in generous theology. We not only have to have the best theology, but we have to make it work with the people we interact with. And that's where I think we've had difficulties as a tribe. So as we move away from Turretin, grateful for the chance to spend this entire discussion session on his Elenctic Theology Institutes. You know, I'm just left with, you know, when I'm old and reading theology books in my 40th and 50th year of studying, I'm 40 years student of the Bible, 25 years serious study of theology. Turretin's going to be top shelf. He's going to be right there. I plan on taking a decade to work through his Elenctic Institutes. They're that worthy. And so I want to commend them in the highest possible regard and sense. And that's why this chapter in the Oxford Handbook was so welcome to me, because even though, like I say, I've had some elbow rubbings with the Turretini, I think I've come back around to see so many of the reasons, the best reasons why they want Turretin to continue in the hearts and minds of people who study theology. So let me throw it over to you for our closing prayer.
Yeah. No, and thank you for that. I think this has been a good conversation, which, has really dealt with a couple of really important issues. First of all, what is Reformed scholasticism and how do we deal with it? And also how do we sort of deal with people who have slightly different ways of phrasing things? And sometimes it does seem like we're harder on those that we're close to than those who are far from us, right? And there's a little bit of that goes on here, and so hopefully by being generous, and even though both of us sort of come from a background that maybe where Turretin wasn't as beloved, shall we say, but having learned why he is beloved by some, I think that's a really important thing. And so I would encourage too our listeners, if you're a Turretini, great, you should be, study him. Also now study some others. And if you're like me and Brock, people who either like me didn't have a lot of knowledge of Turretin, or like Brock, occasionally it had some, relationships with people that made sort of Turretin like, I gotta watch out for this. Make sure, don't just give up. We've got to read Turretin because he's important. And there's much there that is absolutely worthy of study. And like you, I plan, Brock, on spending more time with Turretin. I don't know that I have a 10-year block laid out, exactly what I'm going to go through the Institutes of Elenctic Theology. There's a lot of other stuff that I want to read too, but it is important. And you know what? I think, we don't know exactly what the new heavens and the new earth are going to be like, but I think we're still going to be able to study there. And I think the best of the work that we've done on this earth will in some form be in the new heavens and the new earth. So whether it's, hanging out with Turretin, or whether it's even reading some of his works in heaven, we might have that opportunity. I don't know. It's hard to say. And I hope we do, because I think, man, can you imagine maybe having Turretin and Van Til and Bavinck and Calvin and Augustine and maybe Aquinas, having a bunch of those guys just like, oh yeah, today in the new heavens and the new earth, we're going to meet at the theater of the new heavens, and these are going to be the speakers, and there's going to be a discussion, and that could be a lot of fun. Let's close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we praise you and we thank you. We praise you because you are a God who loves us, a God who cares for us, a God who has saved us from our sins and allows us to live in grace, to live in the glory of unity with Christ. And part of that grace that we receive is being able to read and study people that you have placed throughout history, theologians and philosophers and others who loved your word, loved theology, and really wanted to present it in ways that study the nature of who you are and the nature of your salvation. And Turretin is one of those. And the fact that we can read Turretin and we can read him in English, and that there are so many discussions of what he's written is a measure of your grace for us. And we praise you for that. We pray too that our discussions would be positive, that they would be generous. I pray that as we even sometimes dispute certain issues, that our generosity, even in dispute, will not only be a useful way to learn more and to have more people understand sort of the details of who you are and how you work, but also will be a sign to the nations that of grace and of the love that you have, because we show grace and love even in our disputations. And so I pray for even more of that generosity of spirit, while still holding a desire to hold firm to the truth. Send your spirit on us in that way. We pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.